I was excited when the dance group Spiral Arts approached me and suggested that they do a dance improvisation to my paintings on the theme Through the Eye of the Pandemic, the Darkness and the Light. This is a film about that day in late 2021, in which the event took place. I was in New York in March 2020, when COVID broke across the world. You may remember it hit New York very, very violently at the start. And when I came back to London, the same thing. I found that suddenly everyone was kind of engulfed by the news and very frightened of this. I went into a serious, severe lockdown, but decided that I wanted to use the time as creatively as possible because I now had more time than I'd ever had, and I wanted to paint. Why I mentioned New York was because I'm very interested in the theme of the denial of death. And it felt to me terribly important at this time because you may remember that almost no city in the world, no country was prepared for this. And it took a long time to function adequately to deal with this catastrophe. So I think there was a lot of denial at the time. And I think what I wanted above all was not to deny, to say something in my painting about the reality of what was going on. The first images that really hit home for me were images of photographs and films of what was happening in the European cities, particularly in northern Italy. So all of that gave me a sense of the Mediterranean countries being very embattled. And that's what I tried to portray in the paintings, focusing particularly on the cities and the streets in the cities, the buildings and the streets, and the old parts of the cities, which for me were the most kind of wonderful and beautiful and archaic and just splendid. So these two paintings are part of a series. I did about 6 or 8 just scenes of streets and buildings. What I tried to convey was the desolation of the cities, with the windows and doors all blacked out. So I tried to have a sense of the kind of paradox of windows and doors that are normally openings to the world potentially, but that became very closed during this time. And a sense of the desolation of the streets, no people there, very few cars, and so on. That was how I got into this series of paintings. That's the mood that I felt that I was trying to portray. This is the biggest painting I'll be showing you, and probably the most important in terms of symbolism and so on. As you can see, it's a townscape with the old buildings and their patina of age, with hills in the background, a church steeple, a tower. When I finished it initially, the sky was completely empty. I then put in a small bird in the background that was hardly visible. I thought it should be subtle and the bird could convey whatever you might want it to convey. But it seemed very trivial, actually. So I decided to do a bigger presence in the sky, another bird, and I produced this figure. And immediately I thought I had finished it. I was quite upset by it because it looked rather monstrous and very ambiguous, and it didn't look particularly like a bird, even though it had bird-like characteristics. And if you look carefully at the face, it's a sort of uncomfortable mixture of human, animal, bird-like, etc. But I decided I would leave it because it struck me that probably unconsciously I was saying something that was more relevant than having a rather benign bird somewhere in the background. It could be anything. It could be an angel of death, an angel of mercy, that people have responded in very different ways.
One side, one place. Ha, ha, take it. Ha, take it, take it. Go on, take it. Go on, go on, go on. Ha.
I was very struck by people's stories about how they would find refuge in their own homes. And of course, our homes became so incredibly important to us. They were the one place of safety. On the other hand, there were stories of a terrible sense of imprisonment, of being very confined, of being trapped, of finding it unbearable to have to stay indoors. I thought that maybe that is a kind of universal symbol of home, in a way that it's a container, it's where we can retreat. On the other hand, it can also become a prison. And it kind of links to psychotherapeutic work insofar as there's a way of understanding people's issues about intimacy and relationships in terms of the same dynamic of wanting to move forward and wanting to move back. People want to have a relationship, want to be intimate, want to embrace the other, but then become very afraid of that and they move away. And so it's sometimes described as sort of twin fears of abandonment and engulfment. So as you move away, you're afraid you're going to be left alone, isolated. You move towards someone, you then fear you're going to be engulfed. You know, we want to belong to a group and we don't want to belong. We want to join and we want to keep our independence, our sovereignty. And it's, I think, a universal dilemma is how close to get and how far to get. And I think for lots of people, it's hard to regulate the degree of closeness and distance. So that's really what the pandemic and the problem about home signified for me, or how I came to understand it, apart from all the other terrible real dangers, of course, that existed for people. Also, just to round that off, that behind all of this is the fear of annihilation, which is our deepest and darkest fear and most real fear of not being able to survive, which of course the pandemic really triggered in very powerful ways and is still doing maybe to a lesser extent. So underlying this dilemma about closeness and distance is also a wish to survive and a fear of being annihilated. I live in a part of North London that is very wooded. There are two great woods. One is Highgate Wood, the other one is Queenswood, and my house actually backs onto Queenswood. And it was only during lockdown, with more time and a kind of desperate longing to get out of the house and to rediscover the world, that the only safe place to do so was the woods. And so I rediscovered the woods all over again in a way that felt quite transformational for me, and that's really what these images are about. This one I've called Light in the Woods, which is significant for me because one of the experiences I have all the time really is the interplay of light and shade in the woods. When the sunlight shines, it's really very magical. A sense of the almost miraculous way in which light could appear suddenly, almost out of nowhere. The whole thing became for me a very intense experience of being in the moment and being connected to nature. So this is a fairly abstract image of the idea of light in the woods, which and the connection I felt, which was so intense really. In my many journeys through the woods, I also became very aware of the wildlife in the woods, which I'd been aware of before, of course, but hadn't focused on. And it was just captivating to see all the various animals and spend time looking at them. And one of the themes that emerged from me, and I painted quite a lot of different creatures, a fox that came slyly into the woods in the evening, squirrels, birds, and so on. But I decided to show the owl because there was something about the symbol of the owl. For one thing, just personally, I love owls because I love the sound they make, the hooting or tooting or whatever it's called. And from my bedroom window, I can hear owls calling in the woods at night. And I always feel very comforted by this. It sounds like the world is at one, the world is at peace with itself. But actually, the owl is quite a predator. You know, it kind of goes for all sorts of little animals, mice, and so on. I thought that it was important because it reflects something about the violence lurking in nature. That nature isn't just the soft touch. There's a lot of struggle and fight for survival in nature. So while a lot of destructiveness is being done to nature now in terms of climate change, there is also a kind of inherent cycle of survival and death that goes on all the time, a drama.
Things are not as they seem.
Quite often in the woods and in this natural world, I would encounter people in a way I hadn't before. And I think it had something to do with lockdown. Because of the isolation, I had a lot of anxiety about my own health. And although I was in touch with people, it was largely on Zoom and other devices. So that to actually see people, it felt to me that the connections were deeper than ever. And that's one of the things that I so valued about nature. It brought people together because we all shared in this, the miracle of nature in a way we hadn't before. People who see it as just one figure or an animal don't, I think, see two figures. Because it was an elderly couple, a man and a woman, who was obviously not well and kind of holding on to the man. He's kind of propping her up. And I would see them quite often in the woods. And I didn't know who they were. And I was just kind of impressed. Almost whenever I went, there they were, trudging through the woods. And I thought it was really rather poignant. They obviously came there for a bit of exercise or to be in touch with nature, chose the woods as the way, a place to be, maybe with the kind of hope of freedom or connection or something like that. This one was on a very muddy day, also a rather lovely day. I was trudging through the woods myself, and these two were walking past the playground. It was obviously a father and a little boy whose hand he was holding. And this little boy was having great difficulty in his little wellies, trudging through the mud. And he kept sort of looking up at his father, and I didn't at that point hear what he was saying, but it looked as if he was saying, "Daddy, pick me up." You know, sort of, and the father was kind of rather impatient and sort of saying, you know, come on, you can do it. And then I heard him saying, no, I can't pick you up because you're filthy, you'll make me dirty. And I think the boy became quite desperate, actually, and I could see how he was struggling in this quite deep mud. He sort of reached up to his father, and finally his father relented and kind of scooped him up. And that was the image of the father holding him. Something happened in that moment. Maybe they both felt this was right. The little boy clearly felt relieved and happy to be in his daddy's arms. And the father probably felt a kind of compassion for the little boy. But there was also something about their being in nature at that moment. Because again, the bird song was wonderful. The light and the shadows were interplaying. I was very captivated by this image, and I felt that it was really somehow very significant for me, very touching. I felt that it was very much about containment, nature as containing us, almost a parental presence. We tend to think of Mother Nature, you know, for obvious reasons. This was a father, but I think the gender doesn't matter. It's more about the ultimate containment that we probably all long for, that I think we felt we lost during the pandemic and then regained again through nature. And it was something about that moment that I wanted to capture and bring to you today. the lovely coming together of the images, music, sound, voices, movement, dance.
You are responding in your way, we're responding to your response. So we are responding to each other, and it becomes sort of one expression, one collective expression. That's the phenomenon that happens in that moment.
From our point of view, it adds so much more depth and perspective and new vision, so we don't get stuck in kind of habitual ways of moving. It takes us out of that.
There's a kind of spirit of togetherness and trust, which I think is unusual and really, I think, helps to facilitate what happens, the spontaneity and so on.
I like art, but it slightly annoys me that it's the artist that I have to listen to, and it's all about them. And yes, it moves me, but it stops there. Whereas this process, it was lovely to use that to bounce it onto me personally and us as a group. And then I was actually able to create my own picture from your original inspiration. And that is, like, for me, the ultimate.
Sarah, thank you very much for what you said. And I'm delighted it came at the end of the discussion, because it really sums up for me not just the experience today, but I think everything I'm trying to achieve in these presentations, that it's not about me showing my work for the sake of showing my work, or how clever I am, or how good the paintings are. It's more a method of communicating to the other so that they can own their own experience and grow from that, whether it's with another painting or another image or sense of themselves or the movement and dance as it was today. Something about the spirit, I think the spirit of connectedness and understanding of self that I'm trying to create. And I felt that you really got it, so thank you.